That's what happens when you lie to police, boy. Officer Derek Hammond's boot slammed down inches from the convulsing man's face, his voice dripping with satisfaction as 50,000 volts still crackled through the air. The taser dangled from his hand like a trophy, while the suited figure on the scorching asphalt gasped for breath, expensive fabric torn and stained with street grime. CIA Director Hammond spat his laughter sharp and ugly. You people watch too many movies. But 300 miles away in a bunker beneath Virginia red lights were already flashing. Biometric sensors had just screamed a code black alert. The second most powerful spy in America was down, and Derek Hammond had approximately 47 minutes before his entire world ended. Before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end. Comment below with your city so we can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The mid-afternoon sun hammered down on Meadowbrook Avenue like a punishment, turning asphalt into a griddle that shimmered with heat. Director Marcus Steele had exactly 6 blocks left before reaching his mother's house when the blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. That familiar tightness seized his chest. The one every black man knew, regardless of the 3 decades he'd spent in intelligence work, regardless of the presidents he'd briefed. Marcus pulled to the curb with deliberate precision, hands visible at 10 and 2. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach. Stocky build, early 30s, that particular swagger that came from never questioning your own authority. The knock on his window wasn't a knock. It was aggression hammered out with knuckles. Marcus lowered the window completely. Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over? License and registration. Officer Derek Hammond's eyes were already scanning the interior with naked suspicion. And step out of the vehicle. Certainly. May I reach for my wallet? It's in my inside jacket pocket. Hammond's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. Slowly, real slowly. Keep those hands where I can see them. Marcus extracted the wallet with surgical precision, reaching across to the glove compartment for the registration. As he handed the documents through the window, Hammond's demeanor shifted from suspicious to openly hostile. Fancy name for a fancy car, Hammond read aloud, contempt dripping from every word. Marcus Steele. How'd you afford a ride like this? What kind of work you do? I work for the federal government. Hammond's laugh cut through the afternoon air like broken glass. Government work, huh? Let me guess. You clean toilets at the post office, or maybe you're one of those affirmative action hires pushing papers around. Marcus felt the familiar weight of racial contempt settling over the interaction, but his training held. Stay calm, de-escalate. I understand, officer. I'll be more careful. But Hammond wasn't finished. Something about Marcus's calm dignity, his expensive suit, his articulate speech fed into a rage that had been building in Hammond's chest. Here was everything he resented. Step out of the vehicle. Now! Marcus complied, moving with deliberate care. At 6 feet tall, with salt and pepper hair and the bearing that came from briefing heads of state, he possessed an authority no uniform could replicate, and that authority made Derek Hammond angrier than he'd been in months. Turn around, hands on the car. Officer, I need to inform you that I'm Director Marcus Steele of the Central Intelligence Agency. Marcus kept his voice steady. I'm carrying federal identification and I need to contact. Hammond's explosion of laughter cut him off. CIA Director Morrison, he called out to his partner who was just pulling up. Get this, we got ourselves a CIA director here. Officer Jake Morrison climbed out of his cruiser, a grin spreading across his young face. CIA, what's next? FBI Secret Service. That's what I said. Hammond was feeding off his partner's amusement now. Mr. Important here thinks he's some kind of federal agent, probably got that ID printed at Kinko's. Marcus remained calm, but Steele entered his voice. Officers, I strongly advise you to verify my identity through federal channels. My badge number is... Shut up. Hammond's mood shifted instantly to rage. You think you can just lie to police officers? You think we're stupid? Turn around and put your hands on the car. The situation was spiraling beyond Marcus's control. Woven into his suit were biometric sensors that tracked his vital signs and location. If those sensors detected a life-threatening situation, they would trigger emergency protocols. Marcus could feel his heart rate climbing. The sensors were registering everything. "Officer Hammond, I am asking you to contact your supervisor immediately. This is a federal matter." Hammond's hands shot to his taser. "Federal matter. The only federal matter here is you lying to a police officer." Time slowed. Marcus saw Hammond's finger on the trigger, saw the cruel satisfaction in the officer's eyes, saw Morrison's expression shift from amusement to uncertainty. In that split second, Marcus understood that nothing he could say would stop what was about to happen. Derek Hammond had made his decision based not on evidence or law, but on rage and racial hatred. "You people watch too many movies," Hammond snarled. The electrical current hit Marcus like lightning. 50,000 volts coursing through his nervous system, every muscle locked in spasm, his vision blurred to white static as he collapsed onto scorching asphalt. His gray suit tore as he hit the pavement. Pain was everywhere, a total system override that made thought impossible, made breath impossible. Hammond stood over him, the taser still crackling. "That's what happens when you lie to police, boy." The word hung in the air like a curse. Boy. Not man, not citizen, not director. Boy. Morrison's nervous laughter joined Hammond's satisfaction. "Damn, Derek, you dropped him like a sack of potatoes. Should have seen his face when I pulled the trigger." Hammond's boot came to rest inches from Marcus's face. "All that government agent disappeared real quick." He nudged Marcus's shoulder. "How's that government job treating you now, Director?" Marcus lay on the burning asphalt, his body still twitching, his suit torn and stained. But his mind was clear. Even through the pain, he knew exactly what was happening. And he knew exactly what was about to happen to Derek Hammond. Because at that moment, at 2:31 p.m., his biometric sensors registered a critical threat to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. 300 miles away, Master Sergeant Elizabeth Hayes was monitoring the classified biometric grid when her screen erupted in red alerts. Heart rate critical, stress indicators maximum, location compromised, threat assessment extreme. Her hands flew across the keyboard. GPS coordinates placed him on a residential street in Richmond. Vital signs indicated severe physical duress. The automated threat assessment was unambiguous. The director of the CIA was under attack. Elizabeth reached for the red phone. "Code black," she said the moment Deputy Director Sarah Chen answered. "Director Steele is down. Location confirmed, Richmond, Virginia. Threat active." The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then Chen's voice came through deadly serious. "Initiate Protocol 7. Full response. Authorization Chen 77 Alpha Delta. Execute now." Protocol 7. The nuclear option. The authorization that granted the Deputy Director authority to mobilize any federal resource necessary up to and including military assets. "Protocol 7 confirmed," Elizabeth said, initiating full response. Time to first contact estimated at 47 minutes. On Meadowbrook Avenue, Derek Hammond was still basking in his moment of dominance, completely unaware that he had just triggered the most sophisticated emergency response system in the world. He reached down and grabbed Marcus's wallet, pulling out the federal identification cards. "Central Intelligence Agency," Hammond read mockingly. "Look at this, Morrison. Professional quality fake ID. Probably cost him $50 online." The badge was real. Crafted with security features Hammond couldn't comprehend, embedded microchips, holographic seals, technology currently broadcasting Marcus's location to every federal facility within 1,000 miles. But to Hammond, it was just evidence that the man on the ground was a fraud. "What should we do with him?" Morrison asked, his enthusiasm wavering. "Book him," Hammond replied without hesitation. "Assault on a police officer resisting arrest impersonating a federal agent. This boy is going to learn what happens when you disrespect the law." Marcus's eyes were open, watching, calculating. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation of lying helpless on the street, where he'd once ridden his bicycle as a child, his mind was working. Derek Hammond had just tasered the director of the CIA and was planning to arrest him for impersonating himself. In approximately 47 minutes, every communication system in Richmond would experience mysterious technical difficulties. In 1 hour and 13 minutes, black SUVs with federal plates would begin converging on the city. But for now, Hammond cuffed the second most powerful spy in America and dragged him toward the patrol car, still laughing about the fake CIA badge. "Come on, Director," Hammond sneered. "Let's get you processed." Marcus didn't resist. His head was spinning from the taser shock. But his training held. Stay calm, comply, let the system work. Because the system was working. Right now, with technology, Hammond couldn't imagine the full weight of the United States intelligence community was mobilizing. The patrol car pulled away, leaving behind only a torn jacket and a cracked cell phone on the asphalt. 6 blocks away, Beatrice Steele was still waiting for her son, wondering why he was late. The peach cobbler was cooling on the windowsill. She didn't know yet that her son was handcuffed in the back of a police car being driven to jail for being exactly who he claimed to be. At CIA headquarters, Deputy Director Sarah Chen stood before a wall of monitors watching red indicators spread across a digital map of Virginia. She had never initiated Protocol 7. No deputy director had in the protocol's entire classified history. "Status," she commanded. "Director Steele's biometrics show stabilization," Elizabeth Hayes reported. "Heart rate decreasing from critical levels. GPS tracking shows movement consistent with vehicle transport." "Where's he going?" "Trajectory analysis indicates Richmond Police Department headquarters." Sarah's jaw tightened. If local police had Marcus in custody, it meant they either didn't know who he was or didn't believe it. Both scenarios were unacceptable. "Have we attempted contact with Richmond PD?" "Negative. Protocol 7 requires operational security until we confirm the director's status." Sarah nodded. "Get me General Harrison at the Pentagon." The secure line connected within seconds. "General, this is Deputy Director Chen. We have a code black situation. Director Steele is compromised. Location confirmed as Richmond Police Department. I need immediate communication oversight for the Richmond metropolitan area." Oversight meaning monitoring or intervention. Intervention, full spectrum. I want every cell tower, landline, and internet connection in that city under our control within 30 minutes. Understood. Pentagon will coordinate with NSA. You'll have full oversight in 27 minutes. Sarah turned to her communications specialist. "Agent Santos, prepare for Richmond communication intervention. If anyone tries to leak this to media, I want to know immediately, and I want the capability to terminate the communication." Agent Maria Santos's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Initiating protocols. NSA coordination confirmed. Cell tower control will begin in 24 minutes. Tactical response. Agent Cross's team is wheels up in 12 minutes. ETA to Richmond 53 minutes. 4 teams, 16 personnel, full federal authority override." Sarah pulled up the personnel file. Agent Ryan Cross, former Army Ranger, exactly the kind of professional who could extract a compromised director without turning it into a publicity disaster. But there was already a disaster brewing. The moment Marcus's sensors triggered code black, automated notifications had gone to a dozen federal agencies. Within the hour, the White House would be demanding explanations. "Pull everything on the arresting officers," Sarah ordered. "Service records, disciplinary history, civilian complaints, social media activity." The data started flowing. Officer Derek Hammond, 15 years with Richmond PD, multiple civilian complaints mostly involving excessive force, all complaints dismissed. Training deficiencies noted in constitutional law. Social media activity showed participation in groups that walked right up to the hate organization line. "Jesus," Sarah muttered. "This guy should never have been allowed to keep his badge." "Gets worse," Elizabeth said. "Pattern recognition shows all civilian complaints involved minority suspects. All use of force incidents involved minorities. The algorithm flags this as statistically significant racial bias with 97% confidence." Derek Hammond wasn't just a bad cop. He was a racist cop whose department had failed to address his behavior until he crossed a line so catastrophic it triggered federal intervention. "I want a full institutional analysis of Richmond PD. Sarah ordered. If Hammond's racism was this obvious in his record, someone at that department was enabling it. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the White House Situation Room. "This is Deputy Director Chen." "Sarah, this is Chief of Staff Morrison. The President wants to know why half of Virginia's telecommunications infrastructure is about to come under federal control." Sarah had prepared for this call. "Sir, we have a code black situation. Director Steele was assaulted by a local police officer and is currently in custody at Richmond Police Department. The arresting officer refused to acknowledge the director's federal credentials and used a taser during the arrest. We're implementing emergency recovery procedures." The silence stretched long enough that Sarah checked her phone. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Let me make sure I understand. A local police officer assaulted and arrested the director of the CIA for impersonating himself. That appears to be the situation, sir." "Jesus Christ. What are the charges?" "Assault on a police officer resisting arrest and impersonating a federal agent." Another long silence. This wasn't just a law enforcement failure. This was a potential diplomatic disaster, a civil rights catastrophe, and a media firestorm. "How do we fix this quietly?" "Agent Cross's team is en route. We should have the director secured within the hour. Communication oversight will prevent media leaks. We're prepared to offer Richmond PD an opportunity to resolve this cooperatively before we impose federal authority." "And if they don't cooperate?" "Then we impose federal authority anyway, sir. Director Steele's safety is our primary objective." "Keep me informed, minute by minute. And Sarah, when this is over, I want a full briefing on how the hell this happened." The call ended. Sarah looked at the operations board where dozens of analysts were coordinating the most complex domestic intelligence operation in recent CIA history. All because one racist cop couldn't believe that a black man in a business suit might be exactly who he claimed to be. In Richmond, Marcus was being processed through booking with bureaucratic efficiency. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph captured from multiple angles. Desk Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez handled the paperwork, but doubt flickered behind her eyes. She kept looking at his federal credentials, which Hammond had thrown carelessly on her desk. "These look pretty real, Derek," Rodriguez said carefully. "That's because whoever made them did good work," Hammond replied dismissively. "But look at him. Does he look like CIA material?" Rodriguez studied Marcus, who met her gaze steadily. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something unmistakably authoritative about him. "I think we should verify these through federal channels," Rodriguez said. Hammond's laughter was sharp. "Federal channels. Come on, Lisa. You really think this guy runs the CIA? The whole thing screams drug dealer trying to avoid prosecution." Morrison nodded eagerly. "You should have seen him, Sergeant. Classic deflection behavior." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I am Director Marcus Steele of the Central Intelligence Agency. My badge number is 7749 Alpha Delta. I need you to contact the CIA Director's office immediately." "Shut up!" Hammond snapped. "Nobody asked you to talk." He turned to Rodriguez. "See, he's got the whole routine memorized. Book him." As Rodriguez reluctantly began the paperwork, Hammond held up Marcus's credentials under the fluorescent light. "Look at this craftsmanship. Embossed seal, multiple security features. Whoever made this really went all out." What Hammond didn't understand was that he was holding one of fewer than 20 such credentials in existence, each crafted by the same facility that produced identification for the president. Every second those IDs remained in unauthorized possession, federal systems were screaming alerts. Marcus watched Hammond with growing concern, not for himself, but for the officer who had no idea what storm he'd called down. Officer Jake Morrison was beginning to experience doubts. He pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages, but actually Googling CIA Director Marcus Steele. The results made his blood run cold. Official CIA website, Wikipedia entry, news articles from major outlets, photographs that matched the man sitting on the bench. "Derek," Morrison said quietly, "I think we should verify those credentials." Hammond looked at him with contempt. "You losing your nerve, rookie? I just Googled him. There's a CIA director named Marcus Steele. Pictures match." So what? That's how these cons work. They use real names to make the lie more believable. But Morrison's doubt was growing. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, saw the intelligence in his eyes, saw the way he held himself, despite being zip-tied and humiliated. "What if we're wrong?" Morrison asked. Hammond's face flushed red. "We're not wrong." For the first time since becoming a police officer, Jake Morrison felt genuine fear about the consequences of his actions. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Agent Ryan Cross's tactical team lifted off from a classified airfield outside Washington, D.C. 4 Black Hawk helicopters carrying 16 of the most highly trained operators in the intelligence community. Cross reviewed digital files on his tablet, memorizing faces and floor plans. This was his first domestic extraction, his first time deploying against American law enforcement. "Team leads final equipment check," Cross said into his headset. "Alpha team ready. Bravo team ready. Charlie team ready. Delta team ready." 16 operators, 4 vehicles waiting at Richmond Airport. Federal warrants already prepared, authorization that superseded any local authority. "ETA 41 minutes, the pilot reported. Cross reviewed the file on Officer Derek Hammond. Civilian complaints, use of force incidents, social media activity suggesting racial bias. The pattern was obvious. Hammond was about to learn that some people couldn't be bullied, some authority couldn't be dismissed, and some mistakes had consequences that reached far beyond anything local law enforcement could protect against. At 3:28 p.m., exactly 27 minutes after the code, Black Alert, the first cell phone tower in Richmond, went dark. Then another. Then another. Within 3 minutes, the entire city's mobile communication infrastructure was under federal control. Citizens trying to make calls found their connections dropping. Text messages failed to send. Emergency calls still worked, but every bit of data was now being routed through federal servers. At Richmond Police Department, dispatcher Tommy Chen was the first to notice. "Sarge, we're getting reports of communication problems all over the city. Cell towers going down." Hammond overheard and felt the first stirring of unease. Communication problems right after arresting someone claiming to be CIA Director. That couldn't be coincidence. Could it? Rodriguez looked up. "How widespread?" "Looks like it's affecting the whole metropolitan area." What was happening was Agent Maria Santos systematically taking control of every communication pathway in Richmond. Cell towers redirected through federal servers. Internet traffic filtered through NSA monitoring stations. The isolation Hammond thought he was imposing on Marcus was about to be imposed on the entire city. Detective Jennifer Walsh walked into the booking area and saw the federal credentials on Rodriguez's desk. Walsh was a 20-year veteran who'd worked federal task forces. She picked up Marcus's badge and examined it. The holographic seal shifted through verification patterns she recognized. The material was distinctive federal cardstock. "Preston," Walsh said quietly, "these aren't fake." Hammond's face flushed red. "Jennifer, come on. I've worked with FBI, DEA, ATF. I know what federal identification looks like. These are real." "They're high-quality fakes. There's no such thing. The security features alone cost more than any criminal could access. Preston, I think you made a mistake." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Walsh picked up the desk phone. "I'm calling the federal verification line." "Don't you?" But Walsh was already dialing. As she waited for the connection, she noticed an unusual delay, like the call was being routed through multiple switches. When someone answered, the voice was crisp and professional. "Federal Personnel Verification. How may I assist you?" "This is Detective Jennifer Walsh, Richmond Police Department. I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be CIA Director Marcus Steele." Another pause. Then the line transferred and a different voice came through. Female, authoritative. "Detective Walsh, this is Deputy Director Chen Central Intelligence Agency. I understand you have Director Steele in custody." The words hit Walsh like a physical blow. The actual Deputy Director of the CIA was on the phone, which meant the man on the bench was exactly who he claimed to be. Which meant Derek Hammond had just committed the biggest mistake in Richmond Police Department history. Ma'am, we have someone claiming to be Director Steele, Walsh stammered. Detective Walsh. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the stammering like a knife. I need you to listen very carefully. Director Marcus Steele is currently being held at your facility under false charges. His identity has been verified through multiple federal databases. I have federal agents en route to your location. They will arrive within 35 minutes. I strongly recommend you resolve the situation immediately. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Put me on speakerphone, now. Walsh hit the speaker button with shaking hands. Sarah Chen's voice filled the booking area, silencing every conversation. This is Deputy Director Sarah Chen, Central Intelligence Agency. To whom am I speaking? Desk Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, ma'am. Sergeant Rodriguez, you currently have CIA Director Marcus Steele in custody under false charges. I am ordering you to release him immediately. Federal agents are en route with full authority. Any officer who impedes this order or causes further harm will face federal prosecution. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Where is the arresting officer? Rodriguez looked at Hammond, who had gone pale as death. He's here, ma'am. What is his name? Officer Derek Hammond. Officer Hammond, Sarah's voice could have frozen nitrogen. You just assaulted and falsely arrested the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Federal agents are coming for you. I recommend you cooperate fully and pray that Director Steele is feeling merciful, because I am not. The line went dead. For a moment, nobody moved. They just stood frozen in the terrible understanding that everything had changed. Hammond's face had gone gray, sweat beading on his forehead. His hands were shaking. This can't be happening, he whispered. But it was real. And in 35 minutes, it was going to get much worse. Rodriguez moved toward Marcus with the keys to his zip ties. Director Steele, I am so sorry. Marcus held up a hand. Just remove the restraints, Sergeant. As Rodriguez cut the zip ties, Marcus stood and straightened his torn jacket. His wrists were marked with deep red indentations. He looked at Hammond, who couldn't meet his eyes. Officer Hammond, Marcus said quietly. In approximately 34 minutes, federal agents will arrive at this facility. They will have warrants for your arrest. They will have authority that supersedes anything you've ever encountered. What you do in these next 34 minutes will determine whether you face those agents as someone who tried to make this right or as someone who compounded his error with continued obstruction. Hammond finally looked up, his eyes wet with tears. I didn't know, he whispered. Marcus's expression didn't soften. You could have known by doing your job, by verifying credentials instead of dismissing them based on racial prejudice, by following procedure instead of following your bias. But you chose otherwise, and now you'll live with those consequences for the rest of your life. The words landed like hammer blows. Rodriguez reached for the phone. I need to call Chief Brennan immediately. Marcus pulled out his cell phone. The screen was cracked but functional. He had 47 missed calls. He dialed from memory. Sarah Chen answered before the first ring finished. Marcus, I'm secure, Sarah. Stand down, Protocol 7. Like hell I will. You were assaulted and falsely arrested. Federal response continues until we have full accountability. Sarah. Don't Sarah me. Agent Cross's team is 28 minutes out. This department is about to learn what happens when they attack the intelligence community. Marcus looked around the booking area at the officers, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Bring the team in, Marcus said quietly. But Sarah, make sure they understand this isn't a raid. It's a reckoning. Understood. Sit tight. Help is coming. Marcus ended the call and sat down on the metal bench to wait for federal authority to arrive with all the inevitability of an avalanche. The confrontation was over. The consequences were just beginning, and Derek Hammond's 47 minutes were ticking away with every beat of his terrified heart. 6 blocks away, Beatrice Steele finally gave up waiting. She covered the cold peach cobbler with foil and called her daughter. Something's wrong, she said. Marcus is never this late. She didn't know federal helicopters were already crossing into Virginia airspace. Didn't know the next knock on her door would be federal agents with a story that would make her proud and break her heart. And nothing, not badges, Not uniforms, not 15 years of enabled racism would stop what was coming next. 28 minutes felt like 28 hours. Marcus sat on that metal bench in the Richmond Police Department booking area, surrounded by officers who couldn't look him in the eye. His torn suit jacket hung loose on his shoulders. His wrists still bore the deep red marks from the zip ties, but his posture remained straight, his gaze steady, his breathing controlled. He was a man who'd survived interrogations in hostile countries, who'd negotiated with terrorists, who'd stared down warlords in rooms where one wrong word meant death. A racist cop with a taser and a badge was nothing compared to what he'd faced in 30 years of intelligence work. But it still hurt. God, it still hurt. Not the electrical burns on his neck, not the bruises forming where Hammond had yanked him to his feet, not even the humiliation of lying on scorching asphalt while a man called him boy. What hurt was knowing that no matter how high he climbed, no matter how many presidents trusted him with their deepest secrets, no matter how much authority he wielded, there would always be a Derek Hammond who looked at his black skin and saw nothing but a threat to be dominated. Rodriguez approached with a bottle of water, her hands still shaking. "Director Steele, is there anything else we can get you? Medical attention? We have an EMT on call." "I'm fine, Sergeant." "Sir, you were tased. You should really be checked out." "I've been shot twice, stabbed once, and tortured by people who make Officer Hammond look like a mall security guard." Marcus took the water bottle, his voice softening slightly. "I'm fine, but thank you." Rodriguez nodded and retreated, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the ticking clock. Across the room, Derek Hammond sat at his desk like a man watching his own funeral. His service weapon had been confiscated. His badge sat in front of him, though he hadn't been officially suspended yet. That would come soon enough, along with federal charges, media scrutiny, and the complete destruction of everything he'd built. Morrison stood beside him, pale and silent. The young officer had tried 3 times to start a conversation, to say something that might make this nightmare less real. But what was there to say? They'd tased the CIA director. They'd arrested him for being who he was. And in 23 minutes, federal agents would arrive with authority that made local law enforcement look like crossing guards. "I should have stopped you," Morrison finally whispered. "When you pulled the taser, I should have said something." Hammond didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the clock, watching the seconds tick away like a death row inmate counting down to execution. "My wife's pregnant," Morrison continued, his voice cracking. "Due in 4 months. I was going to ask for a desk assignment so I could be around more. Now I'll be lucky if I'm not sharing a cell with you." That got through. Hammond's head turned slowly toward his partner. "You didn't tase him. You didn't arrest him. You were just there." "I was more than just there. I laughed. I called him a con artist. I helped you load him into the car." Morrison's hands were shaking now. "I'm complicit. That's what the lawyers will say. I had a duty to intervene, and I didn't." The words hung between them like an indictment, because Morrison was right. Every officer in that booking area who'd watched Hammond parade those credentials around, who'd heard the racist comments, who'd seen Marcus sitting there with quiet dignity and done nothing, they were all complicit. Detective Walsh was documenting everything with her phone, now taking photographs of the booking logs, the timestamps, the chain of evidence. Not for the department, for herself. Because when the federal investigation came, and it would come with the force of a hurricane, she wanted proof that she'd tried to stop it. Chief Thomas Brennan had arrived 15 minutes ago, summoned by Rodriguez's frantic phone call. At 58 years old, with 32 years on the force, Brennan had seen corruption investigations, brutality scandals, and public relations disasters, but he'd never seen anything like this. He stood in his office now, door closed, phone pressed to his ear, talking to the city's attorney. His face had gone from red to pale to gray as the lawyer explained the legal exposure. "Federal charges against Hammond are guaranteed," the attorney was saying. "Assault on a federal official, civil rights violations, false imprisonment. He's looking at 20 years minimum. Morrison's exposure depends on his level of participation. Rodriguez and anyone else who failed to verify the credentials could face negligence charges. And the department itself is looking at a consent decree, federal oversight, millions in settlements." "How do we contain this?" Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. We don't. This is already in federal hands. Our only option is full cooperation and pray they don't burn the entire department to the ground." Brennan ended the call and sat down heavily in his chair. Through the window he could see Marcus sitting on that bench waiting with the patience of a man who knew justice was coming whether Richmond PD cooperated or not. 32 years of service, a pension he'd planned to collect in 2 years, a reputation he'd built case by case, year by year, all of it about to be destroyed because Derek Hammond couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 43 minutes after the code black alert, the first Black Hawk helicopter touched down at Richmond Executive Airport. Agent Ryan Cross stepped out before the rotors stopped spinning his tactical vest marked with CIA insignia that made airport security personnel step back instinctively. 3 more helicopters landed in formation behind him, 16 operators in full tactical gear, armed with federal warrants and authority that superseded every local law enforcement agency in Virginia. 4 black SUVs were waiting, engines running. Cross climbed into the lead vehicle without breaking stride. "Richmond Police Department, fastest route, no sirens but don't stop for traffic lights." The convoy pulled out, moving through Richmond streets with the precision of a military operation, which in essence it was. This wasn't a raid. This was an extraction of a compromised intelligence asset from a hostile environment that happened to be a police station. Cross reviewed the tactical brief on his tablet one final time. Floor plans, personnel roster, arrest warrants for Derek Hammond and potentially Jake Morrison, federal authority documents that would override any local resistance. "Rules of engagement," Cross said into his comms. "This is a federal law enforcement action, not a military operation. We go in professional, we extract the director, we execute the warrants. No weapons drawn unless we meet armed resistance, which we won't. Richmond PD knows we're coming, and they know they can't stop us." "Copy that," came the responses from all 4 teams. "But understand this," Cross continued, his voice hardening. "They assaulted our director. They put their hands on one of ours. So we go in professional, but we go in with the full weight of federal authority. We show them what it means to attack the intelligence community." The SUVs accelerated through an intersection running a red light. A police cruiser started to pursue, then saw the federal plates and backed off. Even local traffic cops knew better than to interfere with CIA operations. Back at headquarters, Sarah Chen was coordinating with every federal agency that had equity in the situation. FBI wanted jurisdiction over the criminal prosecution. DOJ wanted to lead the civil rights investigation. Homeland Security wanted to review the security implications. And everyone wanted to know how the director of the CIA had ended up tasered and arrested by local police. "I don't care about jurisdictional disputes right now," Sarah said into the conference call with all the agency heads. "Agent Cross's team will secure Director Steele in approximately 15 minutes. Hammond and Morrison will be taken into federal custody. Richmond PD will be offered one chance to cooperate. After that, we impose federal authority whether they like it or not." "What about media?" the FBI director asked. "Communication oversight remains active. Nothing gets out until we decide what gets out and when. The president wants this handled quietly if possible." "It's a little late for quiet," the DOJ representative observed. "You've shut down telecommunications for an entire city. People are noticing." "Let them notice. By the time they figure out what happened, we'll have the director secured and the perpetrators in custody. Then we release a carefully crafted statement that makes it clear what happens when you attack a federal official." Sarah ended the call and pulled up the live feed from Cross's helmet camera. The convoy was 4 minutes out from Richmond PD. 4 minutes until federal authority arrived with overwhelming force. At the police station, Marcus checked his watch. 3:51 p.m. Any minute now. He stood straightening his torn jacket, running his fingers through his hair to restore some semblance of order. Not because he cared how he looked, but because he wanted Derek Hammond to see him standing tall when federal agents walked through that door. Hammond saw him stand, saw him prepare, and something in the officer's face crumbled like a dam breaking. Tears started flowing, not the angry tears of a man who felt wronged, but the desperate tears of a man finally understanding the magnitude of his destruction. "I have 2 kids," Hammond said, suddenly his voice loud enough to carry across the booking area. 12 and 14. What do I tell them? How do I explain that their dad is going to federal prison because he couldn't see past his own racism? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. You tell them the truth. You tell them you let hatred guide your actions and you hurt someone because of the color of their skin. And you tell them that actions have consequences. I didn't mean, yes, you did. Marcus's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. Every decision you made today was intentional. You saw my credentials and dismissed them because you couldn't believe a black man could hold my position. You used your taser because I refused to accept your authority to humiliate me. You arrested me because your ego couldn't handle being wrong. Every single choice was deliberate. Hammond opened his mouth to protest, but what could he say? Marcus was right. Every word was true. The tragedy, Marcus continued, his voice softer now, but no less cutting, is that you had 17 complaints over 15 years. 17 times someone said you abused your authority and your department did nothing. You could have been stopped years ago. You could have been taught to see the badge as a responsibility instead of a weapon. But nobody held you accountable, so you kept going until you crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Rodriguez was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Walsh had stopped documenting and was just listening. Morrison had his head in his hands. Even the officers who'd been processing routine paperwork had stopped to hear Marcus's words. So yes, Officer Hammond, you tell your children the truth, and you tell them that you hope they learn from your mistakes, that they grow up seeing people as human beings instead of threats to be dominated, that they understand authority without accountability is just tyranny with a badge. The words landed in the silence like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through every person in that room. At 3:53 p.m., the roar of engines announced the arrival of federal authority. 4 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot with military precision, forming a perimeter that cut off all vehicle access. 16 operators emerged, moving with coordinated efficiency that made local police look amateur by comparison. Agent Cross walked through the front door first. His federal credentials already in hand, his bearing announcing that he was a man accustomed to command and expecting immediate obedience. The lobby fell silent. Civilians waiting for routine police services watched with wide eyes. Desk officers stopped mid-conversation. Even the phones seemed to stop ringing. I'm Agent Ryan Cross, Central Intelligence Agency. His voice carried across the space with absolute authority. I'm here for Director Marcus Steele. I have federal warrants for the arrest of Officer Derek Hammond and Officer Jake Morrison. And I have authorization to assume jurisdiction over this facility if anyone interferes with either objective. Chief Brennan emerged from his office looking like a man walking to his own execution. Agent Cross, I'm Chief Brennan. Director Steele is secure in our booking area. We're cooperating fully with... Take me to him, now. Brennan led Cross and 4 operators through the station. Officers stepped aside, pressing themselves against walls, not making eye contact. The federal presence was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of power that made local authority seem quaint by comparison. Marcus saw them coming before they entered the booking area, saw Cross's tactical gear, saw the operators behind him, saw the federal authority that had mobilized to bring him home. And despite everything, despite the pain and humiliation and rage, he felt something close to relief. Director Cross said, his voice respectful but urgent. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Agent Cross. Just eager to leave. Yes, sir. Cross turned to Brennan. Where's Hammond? Brennan pointed to the desk where Hammond sat now, with his head down, shoulders shaking with sobs that he couldn't control. Officer Derek Hammond, Cross announced, pulling out federal handcuffs. You're under arrest for assault on a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law, and false imprisonment. You have the right to remain silent. Hammond didn't resist as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, didn't fight as 2 operators lifted him to his feet, didn't protest as they read him his rights in voices that carried no sympathy, no understanding, just the cold machinery of federal justice. Officer Jake Morrison. Cross continued, turning to the young officer who looked like he might vomit. You're being detained for questioning regarding your participation in this incident. You're not under arrest at this time, but that could change based on your level of cooperation." Morrison nodded mutely, too terrified to speak. Cross turned back to Marcus. "Sir, we have transport standing by. Deputy Director Chen wants you back at headquarters for debriefing and medical evaluation." "I don't need medical—" "With respect, sir, that's not your call. You were assaulted. Protocol requires full medical clearance before you resume duties." Marcus nodded. Cross was right, and arguing about procedure was pointless. "Very well, let's go." As they walked toward the exit, Marcus stopped in front of Rodriguez. "Sergeant, you tried to verify my credentials. You listened to your instincts even when your colleagues dismissed them. Remember that. Remember that you tried to do the right thing." Rodriguez couldn't speak, could only nod through her tears. Then Marcus stopped in front of Hammond, who was now flanked by federal operators. The officer couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't lift his head, couldn't do anything but cry. "Officer Hammond," Marcus said quietly, "I don't hate you. I pity you. You wasted 15 years of your life serving hatred instead of justice, and now you'll spend the next 20 years paying for that choice. I hope you use that time to become a better man. God knows you can't become worse." With that, Marcus walked out of the Richmond Police Department, flanked by federal agents, leaving behind a booking area full of officers who understood that nothing would ever be the same. The convoy pulled away at 4:02 p.m., exactly 91 minutes after Marcus had been tasered on Meadowbrook Avenue. In the back of the lead SUV, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. "Director," Cross said gently, "your mother has been notified. Federal agents are with her now explaining the situation. She's safe, and she knows you're safe." Marcus closed his eyes. His mother. God, his mother. She'd been waiting for him with peach cobbler and sweet tea, and instead, federal agents had shown up at her door with a story that would break her heart. "Does she know I'm okay?" "Yes, sir. We made sure that was the first thing she heard, that you're safe and coming home." "Thank you." The SUV accelerated onto the highway heading towards CIA headquarters. Behind them, 2 operators sat with Hammond in the second vehicle, transporting him to a federal detention facility where he would await arraignment. Morrison was in the third vehicle, not arrested, but not free his status depending on what he said in the interviews that would begin within hours. Sarah Chen's voice came through Cross's earpiece. "Cross, give me a status update. Director Steele is secure and en route. Hammond in custody. Morrison detained for questioning. No resistance from Richmond PD. Operation successful. Injuries. Director has taser burns, bruising, minor lacerations. He's refused medical, but we're taking him to headquarters medical anyway." "Good. ETA. 47 minutes. I'll be waiting." The convoy drove through Virginia countryside at speeds that would have gotten normal citizens pulled over. But federal vehicles with CIA plates didn't get pulled over. They got escorted. Marcus watched the landscape blur past his mind, already moving from personal trauma to institutional implications. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. Hammond's arrest was one thing. A racist cop facing federal charges would satisfy immediate justice. But the deeper problems, the systemic failures that had enabled Hammond's behavior for 15 years, those required comprehensive reform. "Agent Cross," Marcus said, "when we get back, I want everything. I want Hammond's complete file. I want every complaint against him. I want the internal review procedures that cleared him. I want the training protocols that failed to address his bias. Everything." "Sir, you need rest. I need accountability. Hammond didn't operate in a vacuum. He had supervisors who ignored warnings. He had colleagues who enabled his behavior. He had a system that protected him until he crossed a line so catastrophic it couldn't be ignored. I want that system exposed and dismantled." Cross nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll have the investigative team start pulling files immediately. And Cross, I want to know why it took me getting tased for anyone to take those 17 complaints seriously. I want to know how many other black men Hammond brutalized who didn't have federal credentials to prove their humanity." The weight of that question settled over the SUV like a physical presence. How many others? How many traffic stops had ended with unnecessary violence? How many arrests had been driven by racial bias? How many lives had Hammond damaged before he finally attacked someone whose position forced accountability? At 4:31 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Despite everything, despite federal agents and CIA protocols and national security implications, Beatrice Steele was still his mother. "Baby, are you okay? These nice agents told me what happened. I'm so sorry. Come see me when you can. I'll make fresh cobbler." Marcus felt his eyes burning. After everything he'd endured, after all the pain and humiliation and controlled rage, it was his mother's simple message that finally cracked his composure. "Sir?" Cross asked concern in his voice. "I'm fine. Just my mother being my mother. Family has a way of cutting through everything else, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The convoy crossed into CIA headquarters' secure perimeter at 4:49 p.m. Security gates opened automatically, recognizing the federal plates and the classified transponders. They drove directly to the medical facility where a team was waiting. Sarah Chen stood at the entrance, her face showing the strain of the last 2 hours. When Marcus stepped out of the SUV, she allowed herself one moment of unprofessional emotion, pulling him into a brief hug. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she said. "I'll do my best to avoid racist cops in the future." "That's not funny. It's a little funny." Sarah pulled back, studying his face with the intensity of someone who'd known him for 20 years. "Medical first, debriefing second. Then we figure out how to turn this catastrophe into institutional reform. Always thinking 3 steps ahead." "Someone has to. You're busy being dignified and traumatized." Marcus allowed himself to be led into the medical facility where doctors began their examination, despite his protests that he was fine. They documented the taser burns, the bruising, the lacerations. They took blood samples and ran neurological tests and performed every procedure their protocols required. And through it all, Marcus's mind was already moving forward. Hammond would face justice. Morrison would probably cooperate and get a lighter sentence. Richmond PD would undergo federal oversight and comprehensive reform. But the bigger question remained: how did they prevent the next Derek Hammond? How did they address systemic racism in law enforcement before it escalated to federal incidents? How did they change a culture that had enabled abuse for generations? Those questions didn't have easy answers, but Marcus had 91 minutes of burning motivation to find them. At 6:15 p.m., cleared by medical and wearing borrowed CIA clothing since his suit was evidence, Marcus sat down for his official debriefing. The room was crowded with representatives from every federal agency with jurisdiction: FBI, DOJ, Homeland Security. Even the Pentagon had sent a liaison. "Director Steele," the FBI representative began, "walk us through the incident from the beginning." Marcus took a breath and began to speak, laying out every detail with the precision of a trained intelligence professional. The traffic stop, Hammond's escalating racism, the dismissal of his credentials, the taser, the arrest, the booking process, the federal response. He spoke for 47 minutes without interruption, his voice steady, his memory flawless, his analysis cutting through any attempt to soften what had happened. "This wasn't an honest mistake," Marcus concluded. "This was systemic racism manifesting as police violence, and it represents a threat to every federal official and every citizen of color who encounters law enforcement. We have an opportunity now, with national attention focused on this incident, to demand comprehensive reform. I intend to use that opportunity." The room was silent for a moment. Then the DOJ representative spoke. "Director Steele, with your permission, we'd like to use this incident as the foundation for a nationwide review of police training procedures regarding federal credentials. We want to establish clear protocols that prevent this from ever happening again." "You have my full support, but don't stop there. Review use of force policies, review complaint procedures, review the culture that allows officers like Hammond to operate with impunity for 15 years. This is about more than federal credentials. This is about fundamental civil rights." "Agreed. We'll need your continued cooperation as we build the case." "You'll have it." Every minute of testimony you need. At 8:47 p.m., Marcus finally left headquarters and headed to his mother's house. Federal agents had offered him transport, offered him protection, offered him everything except what he actually needed, which was 6 blocks of normalcy and his mother's peach cobbler. He drove himself in a borrowed sedan, taking the same route he'd taken 8 hours earlier, past the spot where Hammond had pulled him over, past the stretch of asphalt where he'd convulsed under 50,000 volts, past all the markers of his trauma. His mother was waiting on the porch when he arrived, and the sight of her nearly broke him again. 78 years old, gray hair pulled back, wearing the same apron she'd worn for 50 years, holding him like he was still 12 years old and had fallen off his bicycle. "My baby," she whispered. "My beautiful, accomplished, powerful baby. I'm so sorry this happened to you." And Marcus, who had maintained his composure through assault and arrest and federal debriefing, finally let himself cry in his mother's arms. They sat in her kitchen eating reheated peach cobbler, and she didn't ask for details, didn't demand explanations, just held his hand and let him be her son instead of the director of the CIA. "Mama," Marcus said finally, "I'm going to make sure this means something. I'm going to make sure Hammond's racism leads to changes that protect other people. I'm going to turn this nightmare into something that matters." Beatrice smiled, squeezing his hand. "Baby, you already have. You handled that situation with dignity and grace and strength. You showed the world what real authority looks like, and it doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It comes from here." She touched his chest. "From who you are inside, and nothing Derek Hammond did today changed that." Marcus nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. His mother was right. Hammond had tried to diminish him, to reduce him, to strip away his dignity and authority, but he'd failed, because true authority couldn't be taken by force. It could only be surrendered by choice, and Marcus Steele had surrendered nothing. At 10:33 p.m., in a federal detention cell 50 miles away, Derek Hammond lay on a thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, finally understanding that his 47 minutes of borrowed time had expired completely. Tomorrow would bring arraignment lawyers, media scrutiny, and the beginning of a legal process that would consume years of his life. His career was over. His marriage was ending. His children would grow up knowing their father as the racist cop who'd attacked the CIA director, all because he couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. The consequences Marcus had promised were no longer coming. They had arrived crushing and complete and inescapable. And in a small house on Meadowbrook Avenue, Marcus Steele sat at his mother's kitchen table, eating peach cobbler and planning institutional reforms that would reshape American law enforcement for generations to come. Justice had been served, the reckoning was complete, and nothing would ever be the same. The media found out at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. Marcus was standing in his kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like ash when his phone erupted with notifications. News alerts, Twitter mentions, text messages from colleagues across the intelligence community. Someone had leaked the story, and now it was everywhere. CIA Director tasered and arrested by local police in shocking civil rights incident. Federal agents storm Richmond PD after Director Marcus Steele assaulted. Racist cop attacks nation's top spy, what went wrong? Sarah Chen called before Marcus could finish reading the first article. Turn on the news. Any channel. It doesn't matter which one. Marcus grabbed the remote. CNN had breaking news graphics. Fox was running analysis segments. MSNBC had civil rights experts already lined up. Every major network had the story, and they were running with it hard. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Someone had filmed Hammond's traffic stop from across the street. The video showed Marcus being tased, showed him falling, showed Hammond standing over him with that boot inches from his face. And crucially, horrifyingly, the audio had captured Hammond's voice. That's what happens when you lie to police, boy. The word boy echoed across cable news, social media, and morning radio shows. That single word, loaded with centuries of racist dehumanization, delivered by a police officer to the director of the CIA. Who leaked it? Marcus asked. We're still determining that. Could be someone at Richmond PD trying to get ahead of the narrative. Could be a civilian who filmed it. Could be an officer with a conscience. Does it matter? Yes, because if it was deliberate, someone's trying to control how this story gets told. Then we control it better. White House wants you to do a press conference today, noon. Full statement about what happened and what changes you're demanding. Marcus felt exhaustion settling into his bones. He'd slept maybe 3 hours. His body still ached from the taser. The burn marks on his neck were visible even after medical treatment. I look like hell, Sarah. Good. Let them see what Hammond did. Let them see the physical evidence of his assault. Then let them hear you speak with clarity and authority about institutional reform. This is our moment, Marcus. Don't waste it. She was right. Marcus knew she was right. This wasn't about his pride or his pain anymore. This was about using his position and his platform to force changes that should have happened decades ago. Noon. I'll be there. At Richmond Police Department, Chief Brennan was conducting damage control that felt more like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. City council members demanding explanations, the mayor threatening his job, the police union lawyer explaining that the department was facing catastrophic liability, and the protesters. God, the protesters had started gathering at dawn. By 7:00 a.m., there were 50 people outside the station with signs. By 8:00 a.m., 200. By 9:00 a.m., the crowd had swelled to over 500, and they were chanting loud enough to be heard through the station's reinforced walls. No justice, no peace, prosecute police. Rodriguez stood at the window watching the growing crowd with something like despair in her eyes. Chief, this is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. The union's already putting out statements defending Hammond, calling it a misunderstanding, saying he was just doing his job. Brennan's hands clenched into fists. Hammond tased the director of the CIA and called him boy. There's video. There's audio. What part of that is defensible? The part where he's one of theirs. The union doesn't care about truth. They care about protecting their members, even when their members are indefensible. The union's statement had gone out at 6:52 a.m., 5 minutes after the story broke. Richmond Police Union President Carl Peterson had called Hammond a dedicated officer who made a difficult judgment call in a tense situation, had suggested that Marcus's failure to comply with lawful orders had escalated the encounter, had implied without quite saying it directly that Marcus bore some responsibility for his own assault. The statement had lasted exactly 17 minutes before the backlash forced Peterson to delete it and issue a new one expressing concern about the incident and promising full cooperation with federal investigators. But screenshots lived forever, and Peterson's initial defense of Hammond was already being dissected across social media. Detective Walsh walked into Brennan's office without knocking. Chief, we need to talk about what happens when federal investigators show up with subpoenas for our files. When you mean today? I mean in about 2 hours. DOJ just called. They want every document related to Hammond, every complaint, every use of force report, every training record, every performance evaluation. They want to know who supervised him, who reviewed his cases, who approved his continued employment despite 17 complaints. Brennan felt something cold settle in his stomach. They're not just investigating Hammond. They're investigating the entire department. Bingo. And Chief, when they start digging, they're going to find things. A lot of things. Hammond wasn't the only officer with a pattern of complaints. He was just the only one who attacked someone important enough to force accountability. The implications spread through Brennan's mind like cracks in ice. How many other officers had complaint patterns that should have triggered intervention? How many use of force incidents had been approved without proper scrutiny? How many times had the department chosen to protect its own instead of protecting the community it served? At 9:33 a.m., Jake Morrison sat in a federal interrogation room facing 2 DOJ attorneys who looked at him with expressions that suggested they'd already decided his guilt. His lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Martinez, sat beside him looking overwhelmed. Officer Morrison, the lead attorney began, let's be very clear about your situation. You were present during the assault on Director Steele. You participated in his arrest. You failed to intervene when your partner used excessive force. That makes you complicit under federal civil rights law. Morrison's hands were shaking. He'd barely slept. His pregnant wife had cried all night. His future, which had seemed bright and full of possibility 48 hours ago, now looked like a prison cell. "I didn't know," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to God, I didn't know who he was." "But you knew your partner was being aggressive. You knew the man was calm and cooperative. You knew Hammond dismissed federal credentials without verification. What you knew or didn't know about Director Steele's identity is irrelevant. What matters is whether you fulfilled your duty to intervene when you witnessed constitutional violations." "I was 3 months out of field training. Hammond was my training officer. I was taught to back my partner." "You were taught wrong, and now you have a choice. You can cooperate fully with this investigation, provide testimony about Hammond's behavior and the culture that enabled it, and we'll consider reduced charges. Or you can stay loyal to a man who destroyed your career, and you can face the full weight of federal prosecution." Martinez leaned close to Morrison, whispering urgently, "Take the deal. Tell them everything. It's your only chance." Morrison closed his eyes, thinking about his wife, his unborn child, the future he'd imagined. Then he opened them and looked at the federal attorneys. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with Hammond's comments about minority suspects. What did he say? What did he teach you?" And Morrison started talking about Hammond's teaching moments that were thinly veiled racist rants, about the informal lessons in how to justify excessive force, about the culture within the department that rewarded aggressive policing and punished officers who questioned their colleagues. Every word was another nail in Hammond's coffin, but it was also an indictment of the system that had created Derek Hammond and protected him for 15 years. At 10:47 a.m., Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. The burn marks on his neck were visible angry red welts that no amount of makeup could fully conceal. Good. Let people see. Let them understand that this wasn't theoretical, wasn't abstract, wasn't a policy debate. This was violence. State-sanctioned violence delivered by a man with a badge and a taser. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Saw the news. Oh my God, Marcus. Are you okay? Why didn't you call me?" He typed back quickly. "I'm fine. Didn't want to worry you. Going to do a press conference at noon." "You look exhausted on TV. Are you sure you should be doing this today? You were assaulted yesterday." "That's exactly why I need to do this today. While people are paying attention, while the outrage is fresh, before the spin machine turns this into a both sides story." His sister sent back a heart emoji and the words, "I love you and I'm proud of you." Marcus pocketed his phone and took one last look in the mirror. The man staring back looked older than he had 2 days ago, looked tired, looked hurt, but he also looked determined, and that would have to be enough. Sarah was waiting in his office when he arrived at headquarters. "Media's already setting up. Every major outlet, international press. This is going to be watched by millions. No pressure. Marcus, are you sure you want to do this? We could have the White House press secretary handle it, let you recover, and let someone else control my narrative." "No, this happened to me. These are my words, my story, my demands for change." "Okay. Then here's what you need to know. Hammond's union is pushing back hard. They're claiming he was following protocol. The right-wing media sphere is already suggesting you somehow provoked the assault. And there are talking heads questioning whether federal officials should get special treatment under the law." Marcus felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Special treatment? I got tased for being black in a business suit. The only special treatment I want is equal treatment under constitutional law." "I know, but you need to be prepared for hostile questions. Some reporters are going to try to trap you into saying something inflammatory." "Let them try. I've been interrogated by hostile foreign agents. I think I can handle Jim Acosta." At 11:47 a.m., the White House press briefing room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Cameras lined the back wall. The energy was electric, that particular tension that came before major news events that would dominate coverage for weeks. Marcus walked to the podium at exactly noon, his bearing commanding. despite the visible injuries, his presence filling the room in a way that made people instinctively straighten. Good afternoon. I'm Director Marcus Steele of the Central Intelligence Agency. 2 days ago, I was pulled over by Officer Derek Hammond of the Richmond Police Department while driving to visit my mother. What should have been a routine traffic stop became a civil rights nightmare when Officer Hammond refused to acknowledge my federal credentials, assaulted me with a taser, and arrested me for impersonating myself. The room was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. I want to be very clear about what happened and why it matters. This incident was not a misunderstanding. It was not a difficult judgment call. It was racial profiling that escalated to violence because Officer Hammond could not conceive that a black man in a business suit might hold federal authority. When I presented my credentials, he dismissed them as fake without verification. When I asked him to contact his supervisor, he responded with a taser. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The word boy was used while I lay convulsing on the ground. That word carries centuries of dehumanization. That word was chosen deliberately to diminish me, to put me in what Officer Hammond believed was my place. And that word represents everything wrong with policing in America, when officers see citizens, particularly citizens of color, as threats to be dominated rather than people to be served. A reporter's hand shot up, but Marcus continued, I'm fortunate. I had federal credentials that triggered emergency protocols. I had the resources of the intelligence community mobilizing to secure my release. But how many other people has Officer Hammond brutalized who didn't have those protections? His file shows 17 complaints over 15 years, all involving minority suspects. 17 times someone said he abused his authority, and his department did nothing. Now Marcus stopped his eyes, scanning the room. Questions. The room erupted, hands waving, reporters shouting. Marcus pointed to a woman from the Washington Post in the front row. Director Steele, some have suggested that this incident is being used to push a political agenda about police reform. How do you respond? Marcus's expression hardened. I respond by saying that I was assaulted by a police officer who called me boy while I was handcuffed and helpless. If demanding accountability for that assault is political, then I'm guilty as charged. But I'd suggest that the only political agenda here is the one that wants to defend indefensible police violence. Follow up, the reporter pressed. The police union has suggested you bear some responsibility for escalating the encounter by not immediately complying with Officer Hammond's orders. I complied with every order. I moved slowly. I announced my intentions. I presented my credentials. I remained calm even when Officer Hammond subjected me to racist interrogation about how I could afford my vehicle. The only escalation came from his decision to use force against an unarmed cooperative citizen because his ego couldn't handle being wrong about my identity. Marcus pointed to another reporter. Yes, the gentleman from CNN. Director, what specific reforms are you calling for? I'm calling for mandatory federal credential verification training for every police department in America. I'm calling for independent review of all use of force incidents. I'm calling for pattern recognition systems that flag officers with multiple complaints before they assault someone. And I'm calling for federal oversight of police departments that show systemic civil rights violations. A reporter from Fox News jumped in without being called. Director, critics say you're using your position to attack law enforcement when they're just trying to do a difficult job. Marcus's jaw tightened. I spent 30 years in intelligence work doing a difficult job in dangerous places. Difficult doesn't excuse abuse. Dangerous doesn't justify racism. And wearing a badge doesn't grant immunity from constitutional requirements. Officer Hammond had a difficult job. He chose to do it badly with prejudice and violence. Now he faces consequences. But, Director, no. Marcus's voice cut through the interruption like a blade. I'm not finished. I want to be clear about something. I don't hate police. I don't want to defund or abolish law enforcement. I want to reform it. I want police who see their badges as responsibilities rather than weapons. I want training that emphasizes de-escalation over domination. I want accountability systems that remove problem officers before they attack CIA directors or anyone else. He paused, his expression softening slightly. There were good officers at Richmond PD. Sergeant Rodriguez tried to verify my credentials. Detective Walsh recognized them as authentic immediately. Those officers were overruled by a culture that valued loyalty over truth. That culture is what needs to change. Another reporter. What about Officer Morrison? Should he face the same charges as Hammond? Officer Morrison was a young officer following his training officer's lead. He made mistakes. He failed to intervene. But his level of culpability is different, and I trust federal prosecutors to make appropriate charging decisions. What I care about is whether Morrison learns from this, whether he becomes the kind of officer who would stop the next Derek Hammond instead of enabling him. At Richmond PD, officers were watching the press conference on every available screen: the break room television, computer monitors, phones. Some watched with anger, feeling attacked. Others watched with shame, recognizing truth in Marcus's words. A few watched with something like relief, grateful that someone was finally saying what needed to be said. Rodriguez stood in the back of the break room, tears streaming down her face. Walsh stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "He mentioned us," Rodriguez whispered. "He said we tried to do the right thing." "Because we did. Too little, too late, but we tried. I should have done more. Should have insisted on verification. Should have refused to process him until Lisa." Walsh's voice was firm. "You can't change what happened. All you can do is learn from it and be better. That's what he's asking for. Not perfection, growth." On the television, Marcus was taking another question about federal overreach, about whether the CIA was appropriate for domestic law enforcement reform. "The CIA doesn't do domestic law enforcement," Marcus said patiently. "But when a CIA director gets assaulted by local police, it becomes CIA business. And when that assault reveals systemic problems that threaten every federal official's safety, it becomes a national security issue. So yes, I'm using my position to push for reform, because my position gives me a platform that most assault victims don't have, and I'd be failing my responsibility if I didn't use it." At the Federal Detention Center, Hammond watched the press conference on a small television in the common area, surrounded by other inmates who'd figured out who he was and what he'd done. Their comments weren't sympathetic. "Man tased the CIA director. Dumbass." Called him boy on camera. What did he think was going to happen? He thought he could get away with it. They always think they can get away with it. Hammond wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known that it was an honest mistake. But watching Marcus speak with such clarity and authority, watching the evidence of his own racism play out on national television, Hammond couldn't find the words. Because there was no defense. Marcus was right. Every word was true. The press conference continued for 47 minutes. Marcus answered every question, faced every hostile inquiry, addressed every attempt to shift blame away from Hammond's actions. By the end, even the skeptical reporters seemed convinced that this wasn't political theater. This was a man who'd survived a traumatic assault and was channeling that trauma into institutional reform. When Marcus finally stepped away from the podium, Sarah was waiting in the wings. "You did good, really good. Twitter's already calling it the most powerful press conference of the year." "I don't care about Twitter. I care about whether it moves the needle on reform." "It will. White House just called. President wants a meeting tomorrow to discuss your reform proposals. House Judiciary Committee wants you to testify, and DOJ is fast-tracking their pattern and practice investigation of Richmond PD. Marcus nodded, feeling exhaustion settling over him like a weight. Good, that's good. Marcus, you need rest. You've been running on adrenaline and anger for 2 days. Eventually you're going to crash. Not yet, not while there's work to do. But even as he said it, Marcus felt his legs threatening to give out, felt the accumulated stress and trauma and sleepless nights catching up with him. Sarah caught his arm as he swayed. Medical, now, not a request. Marcus didn't argue, couldn't argue. He let Sarah guide him to the medical wing where doctors took one look at him and ordered immediate bed rest. At 3:17 p.m., while Marcus was sleeping under medical supervision, the first significant break came in the federal investigation. A Richmond PD officer named David Chen walked into the FBI field office with a flash drive containing 5 years of internal communications about Hammond. The documents were damning. Emails from supervisors dismissing complaints, training reports noting Hammond's aggressive policing style, but framing it as an asset, performance evaluations praising his proactive approach to law enforcement, and most devastating, a memo from 3 years ago recommending Hammond for additional bias training that was never implemented due to budget constraints. FBI Special Agent Rachel Torres sat across from Chen, reading through the documents with growing disbelief. "Officer Chen, why are you bringing this to us now?" "Because I'm tired of being part of a system that protects bad cops. I've watched Hammond for 5 years, watched him abuse people, watched supervisors cover for him, watched the union defend him, and I stayed quiet because that's what you do. You back your fellow officers. But not anymore. Not after watching him tase the CIA director and call him boy. Not after watching the press conference and hearing Director Steele talk about the 17 complaints we all ignored. I can't be part of that anymore. I won't be." Torres made copies of everything, then looked at Chen seriously. "You understand that providing these documents will make you a target within your department. The union will call you a rat. Other officers will freeze you out." "I know. But I became a cop to help people, not to cover up abuse. If that makes me a rat, fine. I'd rather be a rat than complicit." Chen's documents would eventually lead to the resignation of 3 supervisors, the termination of 2 training officers, and federal charges against a union representative who'd actively discouraged officers from filing complaints about their colleagues. But in that moment, sitting in the FBI field office, Chen just felt tired and relieved in equal measure. At 5:43 p.m., Marcus woke in the medical wing to find Sarah sitting beside his bed, working on her laptop. "How long was I out?" 4 hours. Doctors say you need at least 48 hours of rest before resuming duties." "That's not happening." "Marcus." "Sarah, every hour I'm resting is an hour the opposition is organizing. The police unions are going to fight these reforms with everything they have. The right-wing media is going to paint me as anti-cop. And politicians who depend on law enforcement endorsements are going to try to water down any meaningful change. I don't have time to rest." Sarah closed her laptop, her expression serious. "You're going to burn out. You survived the assault, survived the arrest, survived the press conference. But you won't survive sustained exhaustion while fighting institutional battles that could take years." "Then I'll burn out fighting, because the alternative is letting Hammond's assault mean nothing, letting it be another viral moment that generates outrage for a week and then disappears. I can't let that happen." "Even if it destroys you." Marcus met her eyes. "Especially if it destroys me. Because my destruction in service of reform is worth more than my survival in silence." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but you're not doing this alone. I'm reassigning half my staff to support your reform initiative. Whatever you need, you get. Personnel resources, political capital. We're all in. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't die on me. I've put 20 years into training you to run this agency. Be a shame if you keeled over before you got the top job." Marcus smiled despite his exhaustion. "I'll do my best." At 7:22 p.m., the first counterattack came. The National Police Union released a statement calling Marcus's press conference inflammatory rhetoric that endangers officers nationwide. Conservative commentators began framing the incident as federal overreach. And Hammond's lawyer held his own press conference claiming his client was the real victim of a politically motivated prosecution. The battle lines were forming. On one side, civil rights advocates, reform-minded politicians and citizens tired of police violence. On the other, police unions, law and order conservatives, and those who saw any criticism of law enforcement as an attack on public safety itself. Marcus watched the counterattack from his medical bed, his jaw clenched with determination. They thought they could wait him out, thought he'd get tired and move on to other priorities, thought institutional inertia would protect them like it always had. They were wrong. Because Marcus Steele hadn't spent 30 years in intelligence work to be intimidated by police union press releases. He'd faced down terrorists, foreign agents, and hostile governments. A few defensive cops and their enablers didn't scare him. They should have been scared of him. At 9:47 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Director Steele, this is Officer David Chen from Richmond PD. I just provided FBI with internal documents about Hammond's complaint history. Wanted you to know there are officers who support what you're doing. We're not all like Hammond. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something shift in his chest. He'd been so focused on the systemic problems on the unions and the culture and the institutional failures that he'd forgotten about the individual officers who were trapped in that system and desperate for change. He texted back, "Thank you, Officer Chen. Your courage matters. Stay safe." The response came quickly. "You too, sir. You too." And in that moment, exhausted and injured, and facing battles that would consume months or years of his life, Marcus felt something close to hope. Because institutional change didn't happen through top-down mandates alone. It happened when people inside the system, people like David Chen, decided they'd had enough and chose truth over loyalty. Hammond had tried to break Marcus with a taser and racist contempt. Instead, he'd broken something else. He'd broken the silence that protected abusive officers. He'd broken the culture of complicity that enabled their behavior. And once broken, some things couldn't be put back together. The storm was just beginning, but Marcus was ready for it. And he wasn't alone. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood outside the federal courthouse in Richmond, facing a media circus that made his first press conference look tame. News vans lined every available space. Protesters held signs supporting him on one side of the plaza, while counter-protesters waved thin blue line flags on the other. The tension was thick enough to taste. Sarah walked beside him, her hand on his elbow, in a gesture that looked supportive, but was actually steadying. "Ready for this? No, but let's do it anyway." Federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson met them at the courthouse steps. At 43, she'd built a reputation prosecuting civil rights cases that other attorneys considered unwinnable. She looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen too many victims and too few victories. "Director Steele, before we go in, you need to understand what Hammond's defense team is going to do. They're going to attack your credibility. They're going to suggest you provoked the encounter. They're going to make this about everything except what actually happened. I've been interrogated by Foreign Intelligence Services. I think I can handle a defense attorney. Foreign Intelligence Services don't have 12 jurors watching who might be predisposed to believe cops over black men, even black men who run the CIA." Richardson's bluntness was sharp, but necessary. "This jury has 2 black members, 3 Hispanics, 7 white people. The defense only needs one person who thinks cops can do no wrong, and Hammond walks." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Then we make sure they can't look away from what he did." Inside the courtroom, Hammond sat at the defense table looking smaller than Marcus remembered. Prison had aged him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself disappear. His attorney, David Castellano, was everything Hammond wasn't. Expensive suit, confident bearing, the kind of lawyer who could make juries forget evidence through sheer force of personality. Judge Patricia Morrison entered at 900 a.m. sharp, African-American, 62 years old, with a reputation for running her courtroom with iron discipline and zero tolerance for theatrics. She looked at the packed gallery, the media in the back rows, and the federal agents positioned strategically throughout. "This trial will be conducted with decorum and respect," she announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed and held in contempt. That includes media protesters and family members. Are we clear?" Silence answered her. "Good enough." Richardson stood for her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is simple. On October 15th, Officer Derek Hammond pulled over CIA Director Marcus Steele for an alleged traffic violation. When Director Steele presented his federal credentials, Officer Hammond dismissed them as fake without verification. When Director Steele remained calm and professional, Officer Hammond became enraged. And when Director Steele insisted on his rights, Officer Hammond used a taser on an unarmed cooperative citizen, then arrested him for the crime of being exactly who he claimed to be. She paused, letting the words settle. The defense will try to complicate this. They'll talk about split-second decisions and the dangers of police work. They'll suggest Director Steele somehow brought this on himself. But the evidence is clear. Officer Hammond saw a black man in an expensive car and couldn't conceive that he might hold federal authority. So he assaulted him. That's not police work. That's racism with a badge. And it's a federal crime. Castellano's opening was smooth as silk. My client made a mistake. He admits that. But a mistake is not a crime. Officer Hammond had been trained to be suspicious, to question identification that seemed inconsistent with circumstances. He saw someone driving through a high-crime area in an expensive vehicle and made a traffic stop. When credentials were presented that seemed suspicious, he used the tools he'd been given and the training he'd received to manage what he perceived as a potentially dangerous situation. Marcus felt rage building in his chest. High-crime area. Seemed suspicious. The coded language was obvious to anyone paying attention. Black neighborhood, black driver, therefore criminal. Officer Hammond's actions were consistent with his training and department protocols. Castellano continued. The real question isn't whether he made a perfect decision in a tense moment. The question is whether an imperfect decision made in good faith constitutes a federal crime. And ladies and gentlemen, the answer is no. This prosecution is politically motivated, designed to make an example of a dedicated officer who spent 15 years serving his community. The first witness was Marcus himself. Richardson led him through the events, methodically building the narrative piece by piece. Director Steele, when Officer Hammond asked about your employment, what did you tell him? I told him I work for the federal government. And how did he respond? He asked if I cleaned toilets at the post office or was an affirmative action hire pushing papers. A ripple went through the courtroom. Castellano stood. Objection. The witness is characterizing Officer Hammond's tone and intent. Overruled, Judge Morrison said. The witness is recounting what was said to him. Continue, Director Steele. Marcus took a breath. I remained calm. I told him I'd be more careful about my speed. I was trying to de-escalate. But Officer Hammond escalated instead. Yes. He ordered me out of the vehicle. When I identified myself as CIA Director and presented my credentials, he laughed, called them fake, refused to verify them through federal channels. And then he drew his taser and fired it, 50,000 volts. I collapsed on the street and he stood over me, his boot inches from my face, and called me boy. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors were leaning forward. One of the black jurors had tears in her eyes. Director Steele, in your 30 years of government service, have you ever been treated this way by law enforcement? No. Why do you think Officer Hammond treated you this way? Castellano shot up. Objection, speculation. I'll rephrase, Richardson said smoothly. Director Steele, based on your intelligence training in reading situations and assessing motivations, what did Officer Hammond's behavior indicate to you? It indicated that he saw my skin color and made assumptions about my criminality, that he couldn't reconcile being black with holding authority, that his prejudice was stronger than his professional judgment. Thank you, Director. No further questions. Castellano approached for cross-examination like a shark smelling blood. Director Steele, you said you were trying to de-escalate, but isn't it true you challenged Officer Hammond's authority by immediately claiming to be CIA Director? I stated a fact. That's not a challenge. But you understand how that might sound suspicious. Someone claiming to be a high-ranking federal official during a routine traffic stop. Which is why I presented credentials and asked him to verify them through proper channels. He refused. Because he believed they were fake. Can you blame an officer for being cautious about potentially fraudulent identification? Marcus felt his control slipping. He could have verified them in 5 minutes with a single phone call. He chose not to because his prejudice was more comfortable than the truth. Objection. Castellano's voice rose. The witness is making assumptions about my client's mental state. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Director Steele, answer only what you directly observed. I directly observed Officer Hammond dismiss authentic federal credentials without verification, use excessive force on an unarmed cooperative citizen, and call me boy while I was helpless. Those are facts. Castellano shifted tactics. Director Steele, you run the CIA. You've authorized operations that have resulted in deaths. You've made decisions about who lives and dies. Are you really claiming to be traumatized by a traffic stop that ended with minor injuries? The question landed like a slap. Marcus felt Sarah tense in the gallery behind him. Richardson was half out of her seat preparing an objection. But Marcus held up a hand, his eyes locked on Castellano. I've made difficult decisions in service of national security. Decisions that haunt me. Decisions I'll answer for when my time comes. But those decisions were made against people who chose to be America's enemies. Derek Hammond chose to make me his enemy because of my skin color. That's not national security. That's personal hatred delivered with state authority. And yes, counselor being called boy while convulsing on the ground from a taser does traumatize you, regardless of how many hard decisions you've made in your career. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order. This is not a debate platform. But the damage was done. 3 jurors were nodding. 2 others looked uncomfortable. The black juror who'd been crying was now staring at Castellano with open contempt. At the lunch recess, Sarah pulled Marcus into a private room. That was risky. Castellano was trying to bait you into an emotional response. I gave him an honest response. Honest and emotional aren't mutually exclusive. You told him about being haunted by national security decisions. The defense is going to use that. Let them. I'm not going to pretend I'm some emotionless robot just to protect the prosecution's narrative. I'm a human being who got assaulted by a racist cop. If showing my humanity hurts the case deserves to be hurt. Richardson entered, looking frustrated. Director, you did well on the stand, but Castellano's going to call character witnesses who paint Hammond as a dedicated officer with no racist intent. We need to be prepared for that. What about the 17 complaints? Judge Morrison ruled them admissible only if we can show a pattern specific to racial bias. 14 of those complaints were dismissed or resulted in no disciplinary action. The defense will argue they were frivolous. Marcus felt exhaustion settling over him like a weight. 3 weeks of preparation, countless interviews, media scrutiny that had dissected every word he'd spoken. And still there was a real possibility that Hammond would walk free because 12 strangers might decide a cop's word outweighed a CIA director's lived experience. At 2:17 p.m., the defense began calling witnesses. First up was Hammond's former partner from 5 years ago, Officer Michael Torres. Torres testified that Hammond was firm but fair and never showed any racial bias in their time working together. Richardson's cross-examination was surgical. Officer Torres, in your 2 years partnering with Officer Hammond, how many minority suspects did you arrest? I don't recall exactly. More than 10, more than 20, probably more than 20. And how many excessive force complaints were filed during that period? Torres shifted uncomfortably. A few. 7 complaints in 2 years, all involving minority suspects, all dismissed by your department. Did you ever question why Officer Hammond only seemed to use excessive force on people of color? Objection. Castellano was on his feet. Mischaracterizes the evidence. Sustained. Rephrase, Ms. Richardson. Let me ask it this way. Of the 7 complaints, how many involved white suspects? Torres's silence was damning. None. Thank you. No further questions. The defense called Hammond's supervisor, Sergeant Frank Mills, who testified about Hammond's exemplary service record and dedication to the community. But under cross-examination, Mills admitted he'd never personally observed Hammond's interactions with citizens and relied on written reports that Hammond himself had authored. At 4:43 p.m., the defense made a tactical error. They called Hammond's wife, Linda, to testify about her husband's character. Linda Hammond looked broken, her eyes red from crying, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hammond, Castellano asked gently, can you tell the jury about your husband's character? Derek's a good man, a good father. He's not racist. He has black friends. Richardson's cross-examination was brief, but devastating. Mrs. Hammond, you filed for divorce 3 weeks after your husband's arrest, didn't you? Yes. And in your divorce filing, you cited irreconcilable differences and stated that you could no longer remain married to someone whose actions had brought shame to your family. Is that correct? Linda's face crumpled. Yes. So your testimony about your husband's good character is contradicted by your own legal filings. No further questions. Castellano looked like he wanted to object, but had no grounds. Linda left the stand in tears, and even some of the jurors who'd seemed sympathetic to Hammond looked troubled. At 6:22 p.m., after the jury was dismissed for the day, Marcus sat in Richardson's office, reviewing the day's testimony. "How do you think it went?" "Better than expected. Castellano's character witnesses were weak. Your testimony was strong despite his attacks. But the key is going to be the video." The video. The grainy footage filmed by Margaret Wilson from across the street. 73 years old, shaky hands, but she'd captured everything. The taser, the fall, the boot, and crucially, the audio. "When are you introducing it?" "Tomorrow morning. I'm calling Morrison as a hostile witness first to establish Hammond's pattern of behavior, then the video, then I'm resting our case. I want the jury's last image before deliberation to be watching Hammond call you boy." Marcus nodded. The strategy was sound. Morrison had cooperated fully with federal investigators, providing testimony about Hammond's racist comments and teaching moments. His testimony would establish pattern and intent. Then the video would provide undeniable proof. At 8:47 p.m., Marcus returned to his apartment to find his sister waiting on his doorstep. Angela Steele was 3 years younger, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, and she looked furious. "Why didn't you tell me you were testifying today? Because I knew you'd want to be there, and I didn't want you to see me relive that experience." "Marcus, I'm your sister. I have a right to see the man who assaulted you face justice." "You'll see it when the verdict comes in. That's soon enough." Angela pushed past him into the apartment, her anger giving way to concern as she really looked at him. "Oh my God, you look terrible. Have you slept at all?" "Some. Enough." "That's a lie. You look like you've aged 10 years in 3 weeks. She grabbed his hands, examining them like she used to when they were children. "You're shaking." Marcus pulled his hands away. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're traumatized and exhausted, and you're burning yourself out trying to turn your assault into institutional reform while simultaneously testifying against your attacker. That's not fine. That's self-destruction with a noble purpose." "Angela, no. Listen to me. I've represented assault victims for 15 years. I know what trauma looks like. I know what happens when people refuse to process their pain because they're too busy trying to fix the system that caused it. You can't do both at the same time, Marcus. You'll break." "Then I'll break after the verdict, after Hammond's in prison, after the reforms are in place. I'll break when the work is done." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "And what if the work is never done? What if there's always another case, another reform, another battle? When do you get to heal?" Marcus didn't have an answer. Because she was right. The work was never done. There would always be another Derek Hammond, another system that needed reform, another battle that required his voice and his platform, and his willingness to relive his trauma for public consumption. At 10:33 p.m., Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to shut down. Tomorrow, Morrison would testify. Tomorrow, the video would play. Tomorrow, the jury would see the undeniable truth of what Hammond had done. But would they care? Would 12 strangers look at a black CIA director being assaulted and see injustice? Or would they see a cop making a tough call in a tense moment? His phone buzzed. "Sarah." "Turn on CNN." Marcus grabbed the remote, his stomach already sinking. CNN was running a segment about the trial, and they'd gotten their hands on internal polling about public opinion. 43% of Americans believe Officer Hammond should be acquitted. 29% believe he's guilty. 28% are undecided. The divide breaks sharply along racial and political lines, with 72% of white Republicans supporting Hammond versus only 11% of black Americans. Marcus muted the television. 43%. Nearly half the country thought assaulting a CIA director and calling him boy was acceptable police work. Sarah's voice came through the phone. "Don't let it get to you. Public opinion doesn't determine the verdict. It determines whether the verdict matters. Hammond could be convicted and still become a martyr to people who think police should be able to do whatever they want to black people. Then we make sure the conviction sticks and the reforms happen anyway. Public opinion follows leadership, Marcus. You lead, they'll follow. Or they'll dig in deeper. Then they dig in deeper and we keep fighting. That's how change happens. Not through consensus, through determination. Marcus ended the call and returned to staring at the ceiling. His body ached. His mind raced. His soul felt scraped raw. But Sarah was right. The only way forward was through. At 9:00 a.m. the next morning, Jake Morrison took the stand. He looked young and scared, his police career over his pregnant wife sitting in the gallery with a hand on her swollen belly. Richardson approached him with controlled sympathy. "Officer Morrison, you were present during the entire encounter between Officer Hammond and Director Steele." "Yes, ma'am." "And you witnessed Officer Hammond use his taser on Director Steele?" "Yes." "Did Director Steele pose a threat at the time?" Morrison's voice cracked. "No. He was calm, cooperative, hands visible, no sudden movements." "Then why did Officer Hammond use force?" "Because he was angry. The director wouldn't back down, wouldn't accept Hammond's version of reality. Hammond couldn't handle being wrong." Castellano stood. "Objection. The witness is speculating about my client's emotional state." "He's testifying about what he observed," Richardson countered. "Officer Morrison was Hammond's partner. He's qualified to assess his state of mind." "I'll allow it," Judge Morrison said. "But keep it to direct observations, Officer Morrison." "Yes, Your Honor. What I observed was Hammond getting angrier the calmer Director Steele remained, like he needed the director to be afraid or aggressive to justify what he wanted to do. And when the director stayed professional, Hammond snapped. "What did you do?" Morrison's face crumpled. "Nothing. I stood there and watched. I laughed when Hammond laughed. I helped load Director Steele into the patrol car. I did nothing." "Why?" "Because I was taught that you back your partner, that loyalty matters more than right and wrong, that questioning another officer makes you weak." Morrison looked at Marcus, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Director Steele. I should have stopped him. I should have said something. I failed you." The courtroom was silent. Marcus met Morrison's eyes and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. Richardson introduced the video at 10:47 a.m. The courtroom lights dimmed, the screen lit up with shaky footage, and 12 jurors watched Marcus get tased, watched him fall, watched Hammond stand over him with that boot. Then the audio kicked in. "That's what happens when you lie to police, boy." The word echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Several jurors visibly flinched. The black juror who'd been crying during Marcus's testimony had her hand over her mouth. Even some of the white jurors looked disturbed. Castellano tried to minimize the damage during his cross-examination of Morrison. "Officer Morrison, you pleaded guilty to federal charges in exchange for your testimony, didn't you?" "Yes." "So you have an incentive to portray Officer Hammond in the worst possible light. I have an incentive to tell the truth, which is what I'm doing." "But your truth is colored by your desire to reduce your own culpability." Morrison's voice hardened. "My truth is that I watched Hammond assault an unarmed man because of his skin color, and I did nothing to stop it. That's not colored by anything. That's just shameful fact." At 2:17 p.m., both sides rested. Closing arguments began immediately. Richardson's was passionate and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the video. You've heard the audio. You've listened to Director Steele describe his assault with dignity and clarity. The question before you is simple. Do we hold police officers accountable when they abuse their authority, or do we allow them to assault citizens with impunity because they wear a badge?" Castellano's closing attempted to humanize Hammond. Officer Hammond made a mistake. But he's not a monster. He's a man who spent 15 years trying to keep his community safe. A man who made a split-second decision that turned out to be wrong. That doesn't make him a criminal. That makes him human. The jury got the case at 4:43 p.m. Judge Morrison sent them to deliberate with instructions to notify the bailiff when they reached a verdict. Marcus sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah beside him. Richardson pacing nervously. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour felt like a day. At 8:22 p.m., after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word. They had a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Media scrambled for seats. Protesters pushed against barricades outside. Marcus walked to his seat, feeling like he was moving through water, every step requiring conscious effort. Judge Morrison entered. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find guilty? Marcus felt something break open in his chest, relief and vindication and rage all mixed together. On the charge of assault on a federal official, guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. Hammond collapsed at the defense table, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Castellano put a hand on his shoulder, but offered no words. There were no words. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom. Officer Derek Hammond, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be held in 30 days. Until that time, you will remain in federal custody. Bailiff, remove the defendant. As federal marshals led Hammond away in handcuffs, he looked at Marcus one last time. No anger, no defiance, just broken acceptance of consequences that had finally caught up with him. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced the media scrum one more time. Today, a jury held a police officer accountable for racist violence. That's justice. But it's not enough. One conviction doesn't reform a system. We need comprehensive change, training, oversight, accountability. This verdict is a beginning, not an ending. A reporter shouted a question. Director, how do you feel about the verdict? Marcus paused, considering. I feel like justice was done, but I also feel tired. Tired of having to fight this hard for basic dignity. Tired of watching another black man learn that wearing a badge doesn't justify abuse. Tired of knowing there are more Derek Hammonds out there who haven't crossed the line quite far enough to face consequences. What's next? Next is making sure this verdict means something. Next is reform. Next is change. Next is building a system where the next CIA director who gets pulled over doesn't have to wonder if he'll be treated like a citizen or a threat. That's next. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus sat in his mother's kitchen, eating cold peach cobbler and feeling the weight of 3 weeks lifting slightly. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. Beatrice held his hand across the table. You did good, baby. Real good. Hammond got convicted. The system worked. The system worked because you made it work, because you refused to let your pain be meaningless. That takes strength most people don't have. Marcus squeezed her hand. I learned it from you, Mama. Then I taught you well. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd survived different eras of the same struggle, finding peace in shared understanding. The verdict was in. Justice had been served. But the work was just beginning, and Marcus Steele was ready for it. 30 days passed like 30 years. Marcus testified before Congress, twice appeared on 6 national news programs, and delivered speeches at 4 police academies where reform-minded chiefs wanted their officers to hear directly from the man Derek Hammond had assaulted. Every appearance reopened the wound. Every interview required him to relive those 14 minutes on Meadowbrook Avenue. Every speech demanded he transform his trauma into teaching moments for people who should have known better without being taught. But the work was producing results. The House Judiciary Committee had drafted the Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act legislation that would require independent review of all police use of force incidents and mandate bias training for every officer in America receiving federal funding. The Senate was holding hearings. The president had publicly endorsed the reforms, and police unions were fighting back with everything they had. Hammond's sentencing was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. on a cold November morning. Marcus sat in his office at CIA headquarters, staring at the clock, knowing he should feel something other than exhaustion. Victory, maybe. Vindication. Relief. But all he felt was tired. Sarah knocked once and entered without waiting. Car's here. We need to leave in 10 minutes if we're going to make it. I don't know if I can do this again. Sit in that courtroom. Look at Hammond. Listen to his lawyer beg for mercy he never showed me. Then don't go. You've done enough. You testified. You got the conviction. Sentencing is just paperwork. But Marcus was already standing, already reaching for his coat. Because it wasn't just paperwork. It was accountability. It was the final chapter of a story that had started with 50,000 volts and a racial slur, and he needed to see it through to the end. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters again, but the composition had shifted. More signs supporting Marcus, more people chanting for reform. The tide was turning slowly, painfully, but turning nonetheless. Inside the courtroom was packed. Marcus took his seat in the front row, Sarah beside him, and waited for Hammond to be brought in. When the bailiffs led him through the side door, Marcus barely recognized him. Prison had stripped away the swagger, the aggression, the confidence that had allowed Hammond to stand over him and call him boy. What remained was a broken man who'd finally grasped the magnitude of what he'd lost. Hammond's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, my client has shown genuine remorse for his actions. He spent the last months in custody reflecting on his behavior and understanding the harm he caused. We ask the court to consider his 15 years of service, his family circumstances, and his potential for rehabilitation when determining his sentence." Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. "Does the defendant wish to address the court?" Hammond stood slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, Director Steele, I'm sorry. Those words don't fix what I did, don't undo the pain I caused. But they're all I have. I let my prejudices guide my actions. I saw Director Steele's skin color and made assumptions that had no basis in fact. I used my authority as a weapon instead of a responsibility. And I hurt a man who was just trying to visit his mother." His voice broke. "I destroyed my family, my marriage, my career, my reputation. But worse than that, I confirmed every fear that Black Americans have about police. I became the thing that makes parents have to teach their children to be afraid of officers who are supposed to protect them. I can't take that back. I can only acknowledge it and accept whatever consequences you determine." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition that Hammond's words carried genuine understanding of what he'd done. It didn't change anything, didn't reduce his culpability, but it was more than most convicted officers ever managed. Judge Morrison looked at Hammond for a long moment. "Officer Hammond, you were entrusted with authority over your fellow citizens. You were given a badge and a gun and the power to detain, arrest, and use force. That power demands the highest standards of judgment and restraint. You failed those standards catastrophically. You saw a Black man and assumed criminality. You saw federal credentials and assumed fraud. You saw calm cooperation and responded with violence. And you used a racial slur while your victim lay helpless on the ground." She paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom like a judgment from on high. "Your apology is noted. Your remorse is acknowledged. But they don't mitigate the severity of your crime or the institutional damage you've caused. Every police officer in America is now viewed with increased suspicion because you confirmed the worst fears about law enforcement bias. That's your legacy, Officer Hammond. Not 15 years of service, 14 minutes of racist violence." Hammond's head dropped. His lawyer put a steadying hand on his shoulder. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 10 years in federal prison. On the charge of assault on a federal official, I sentence you to 8 years to run consecutively. On the charge of false imprisonment, I sentence you to 3 years to run consecutively. Total sentence 21 years with possibility of parole after serving 17. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Hammond's mother, sitting in the back, collapsed in sobs, and Marcus sat motionless, feeling the weight of finality settling over everything. 21 years. Hammond would be 63 years old when he got out, if he got out. His children would be adults. His ex-wife would have moved on completely. His entire life would have been consumed by the consequences of 14 minutes of hatred. Outside, Marcus faced the media for what he hoped was the last time. Officer Hammond received a sentence commensurate with his crimes. Justice has been served. But sentencing one officer doesn't reform a system. The Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act is still pending in Congress. Police departments across America are still resisting basic reforms. The work continues. A reporter pushed forward. "Director Steele, do you forgive Officer Hammond?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Forgiveness. As if that was something he owed his attacker. as if moving forward required absolving Hammond of responsibility. "I don't forgive him. I acknowledge his apology, and I recognize his remorse. But forgiveness isn't something I'm required to give just because he finally understood what he did wrong. He gets to spend the next 17 to 21 years thinking about his choices. Maybe by the time he gets out, he'll have earned forgiveness, but not yet. Not today." The reporter pressed. "Doesn't holding on to anger hurt you more than him?" Marcus felt rage flash hot in his chest. "You know what hurts being tased for driving while black? Being called boy by someone who swore an oath to protect citizens. Having to relive that trauma in testimony and interviews and speeches, because my position gives me a platform that other victims don't have. That's what hurts. Hammond sitting in prison contemplating his choices doesn't hurt me at all." Sarah touched his elbow, a gentle reminder to de-escalate. Marcus took a breath. "I'm done answering questions about forgiveness. Ask me about reform. Ask me about the legislation. Ask me about accountability. Those are the questions that matter." At 2:47 p.m., Marcus sat in a congressional hearing room facing the House Judiciary Committee for his third appearance. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't testifying about what happened to him. He was testifying about what needed to change. Committee Chairman Robert Martinez gavelled the hearing to order. "Director Steele, thank you for appearing before us again. The committee has reviewed your proposed reforms, and we have questions about implementation and costs. I'm happy to address any concerns, Mr. Chairman." Representative Sarah Collins, a progressive from California, spoke first. "Director opponents of the Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act claim it will hamstring police and make communities less safe. How do you respond?" Representative Collins: "I spent 30 years in intelligence work making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Accountability didn't hamstring me. It made me better. It made me think harder about my choices because I knew I'd have to defend them. Police officers claim they want to be treated like professionals. Professionals are held accountable. That's what professionalism means." Representative Tom Wilson, a conservative from Texas, jumped in. "Director, your experience was terrible. Nobody disputes that. But you're using a single incident to paint all law enforcement with a broad brush. Most officers are good people doing difficult work." Marcus leaned forward. Representative Wilson Officer Hammond had 17 complaints over 15 years. 17 times someone said he abused his authority, all dismissed or ignored. That's not a single incident. That's a pattern enabled by a system that protects bad officers until they do something so catastrophic it can't be ignored. And yes, most officers are good people. Those good officers should welcome reforms that remove the bad ones who make everyone look terrible. Wilson's face reddened. "You're advocating for federal overreach into local law enforcement. That's not the American way. The American way is constitutional rights. When local law enforcement systematically violates those rights, federal intervention becomes necessary. That's not overreach. That's the 14th Amendment functioning as designed." The hearing continued for 3 hours. Questions about costs, questions about implementation timelines, questions about whether federal training standards would respect local autonomy. Marcus answered them all with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for every possible objection. At 6:22 p.m., Chairman Martinez gavelled the hearing to a close. "Director Steele, this committee will take your testimony under advisement as we finalize the legislation. Thank you for your service and your courage in coming forward." Marcus nodded, feeling exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. But there was one more stop, one more speech, one more appearance before he could finally rest. Richmond Police Academy, 7:30 p.m. 200 cadets who'd signed up to be officers before Hammond's assault became national news. 200 young people who needed to understand what could happen when prejudice wore a badge. Chief Angela Torres, the reformer who'd replaced Brennan, met Marcus at the entrance. "Director Steele, thank you for coming. These cadets need to hear from you. They need to understand that the badge comes with responsibility, not just authority." Marcus walked into the auditorium to find 200 young faces staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to genuine eagerness to learn. He took the podium without notes, without prepared remarks, just the truth of his experience and the hope it might matter. "I'm Director Marcus Steele. 2 months ago, one of your former colleagues tased me, arrested me, and called me boy. I'm here to make sure you never become Derek Hammond." The room was silent. Some of you are thinking I'm here to attack police. I'm not. I'm here to challenge you to be better than the officers who came before you, to be the kind of cops who verify before assuming, who de-escalate before using force, who see their badges as responsibilities instead of weapons. A young white cadet in the front row raised his hand. "Sir, how do we do that when we're trained to be suspicious, when we're told that hesitation can get us killed?" "You do that by recognizing the difference between caution and prejudice. Officer Hammond wasn't cautious when he pulled me over. He was prejudiced. He saw my skin color and decided I was a criminal. That's not officer safety, that's racism. Real caution would have been verifying my credentials before using force. Real caution would have been calling a supervisor when he had doubts. Real caution would have been treating me like a human being until I gave him reason not to." A black female cadet in the back stood. "Director Steele, I'm black. I'm also becoming a cop. How do I navigate a system where people like me are often targets of the kind of policing I'm being trained to do?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. "That's the hardest question anyone can ask, and I don't have a perfect answer. What I can tell you is that the system needs officers like you. Officers who understand both sides. Officers who can bridge the gap between community and law enforcement, because you live in both worlds, but you also need to protect yourself. Document everything. Question inappropriate behavior from colleagues even when it's uncomfortable, and remember that your badge doesn't insulate you from the same prejudices I faced." The cadet sat down, tears in her eyes, and Marcus knew his words had reached at least one person who needed to hear them. At 9:47 p.m., Marcus finally made it back to his apartment. The lights were off. The space was quiet. For the first time in 2 months, he had nothing scheduled for tomorrow. No testimony, no speeches, no interviews, just silence and the opportunity to finally process everything that had happened since that October afternoon. He poured a glass of bourbon, sat on his couch, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of trauma he'd been carrying. The physical pain had faded weeks ago. The burn marks were healing, the bruises were gone, but the psychological impact remained sharp and present and exhausting. His phone rang. Angela. "Marcus, I just watched the news. The Senate passed the Accountability Act, 62-38. It's going to the president's desk." Marcus felt something break open in his chest. Victory. Real, tangible victory. They passed it. Full bill, independent review of use of force, bias training, pattern recognition systems, federal oversight of departments with civil rights violations, everything you fought for. "When does it get signed?" "Friday. White House ceremony. President wants you there front and center." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling tears he'd held back for 2 months finally breaking through. "We did it. We actually did it." "You did it, Marcus. You took the worst moment of your life and turned it into legislation that will protect millions of people. You did that." After the call ended, Marcus sat in the darkness crying quietly, releasing the accumulated pain and stress and trauma of 8 weeks that had reshaped his life and American policing simultaneously. He cried for himself, for Hammond's family, for every person who'd been brutalized by officers who faced no consequences, for the system that had enabled so much harm for so long. At 11:33 p.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Director Steele, this is Officer David Chen from Richmond PD. Just wanted you to know that the department implemented new credential verification protocols today. Every officer has been retrained. Hammond's assault is now used as a case study in what not to do. Your pain created change. Thank you." Marcus stared at the message, feeling something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, not closure, but purpose. His trauma had meant something. His willingness to fight through exhaustion and relive his assault in testimony and interviews had produced tangible results. Hammond would spend the next 17 to 21 years in prison. The Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act would reshape American policing. Richmond PD was training officers using his assault as an example, and across the country other departments were implementing reforms to avoid becoming the next national scandal. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the White House East Room, surrounded by civil rights leaders, reform advocates, and members of Congress who'd championed the legislation. President Katherine Morrison approached the signing desk, a dozen pens arranged for the ceremonial signing. Today we're signing legislation that will fundamentally transform how law enforcement operates in America. The Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act is named for the millions of Americans who've experienced police bias, but it exists because one man refused to let his assault be meaningless. Director Marcus Steele, would you join me at the desk? Marcus walked forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The president handed him the first pen, the one that would make the bill law. "This one's yours, Director. You earned it." Marcus took the pen, watched the president sign her name with decisive strokes, and felt history being made. Not perfect history, not complete justice, but progress, real, measurable, significant progress. After the ceremony, Marcus stood in the Rose Garden surrounded by reporters asking for reactions. But he kept his statement brief. 2 months ago, I was tased and arrested for being black in a business suit. Today, that assault became the foundation for reforms that will protect millions of Americans from similar violence. That's not justice. Justice would be living in a world where these reforms weren't necessary. But it's accountability, and accountability is where change begins. At 3:47 p.m., Marcus sat in his mother's kitchen one more time, eating peach cobbler that tasted like childhood and safety and unconditional love. Beatrice held his hand across the table, her eyes bright with pride. "You changed the world, baby. You took your pain and made it matter." "I just told the truth, Mama. That's all I did." "The truth is the hardest thing to tell when it costs you something. You told it anyway. That's courage." Marcus squeezed her hand. "I learned it from you, from watching you navigate this world with dignity, even when people tried to take it from you. Everything I am, I learned from you." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 generations of a family that had survived different iterations of the same struggle, finding peace and shared understanding and hard-won progress. 6 months later, Marcus stood on Meadowbrook Avenue for the first time since the assault. The street looked exactly the same. Children playing on sidewalks, families gathered on porches, the neighborhood continuing its daily rhythms as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act had been in effect for 3 months. 47 police departments were under federal review. 83 officers had been removed from duty after pattern recognition systems flagged their complaint histories. Independent review boards had overturned 62 use-of-force justifications that previous internal investigations had approved. And Marcus had received over 15,000 letters from people thanking him for his courage, for his willingness to fight, for his refusal to let his assault disappear into the news cycle without meaning. He walked to the spot where Hammond had tased him. The asphalt was still there, still hot under the summer sun, but it didn't hurt anymore. The memory was still present, still sharp, still painful. But it no longer controlled him. Sarah had been right. You couldn't fix yourself and fix the system simultaneously. But you could survive the system being broken enough to fix it afterward. And that's what Marcus had done. He'd survived. He'd fought. He'd won. Not completely. Never completely. There would always be another Derek Hammond, another system that needed reform, another battle that required his voice and his platform and his willingness to stand up when standing up cost him something. But standing up was worth the cost, because the alternative was silence, and silence was complicity. Marcus pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the street, of the spot where his life had changed, of the place where his trauma had been transformed into purpose. Then he sent the photo to Angela with a simple message. "Still standing." Her response came immediately. "Always knew you would be." At 6:47 p.m., Marcus drove past his mother's house one more time, past the window where the peach cobbler had cooled while federal agents mobilized to bring him home. Past the neighborhood where he'd grown up, past the streets where he'd learned that being black in America meant navigating a world that saw you as a threat before seeing you as a person. But now those streets were a little safer. Police officers were a little more accountable, and the system that had enabled Hammond's violence for 15 years was a little more just. Not perfect. Never perfect. But better. Measurably, tangibly, significantly better. And that was worth every testimony, every interview, every speech, every moment of relived trauma. Because change didn't happen through hope. It happened through people willing to transform their pain into action. Derek Hammond had tried to break Marcus with a taser and a racial slur. Instead, he'd forged him into something stronger. Something that couldn't be broken by violence, or intimidated by power, or silenced by institutions that valued loyalty over truth. Marcus Steele had been assaulted for being black and holding authority, and he'd responded by using that authority to ensure the next person who looked like him wouldn't face the same violence without consequences. That was his legacy. Not the assault, not the trauma, not the pain, the change, the reform, the accountability. The future where badges came with responsibility instead of impunity, where officers were trained to protect instead of dominate, where citizens could trust that the people sworn to serve them would see their humanity before seeing their skin color. That future wasn't guaranteed, wasn't complete, wasn't perfect. But it was closer than it had been before Derek Hammond made the worst mistake of his life and discovered that some people don't break when you try to break them. They fight back, and sometimes they win. Marcus Steele had been tased, arrested, and called boy on a hot October afternoon, and he'd responded by changing American policing forever. That was justice. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. And for now, it was enough.